The funny thing is I manage personally over 60,000 endpoints in the current environment that I'm in. I do that with 3 people.
Welcome to the Cybersecurity Council. This council strives to showcase unique cybersecurity leadership stories. Its mission is to demystify and simplify cybersecurity across the entire business landscape. Best practices, lessons learned, operational recommendations, it's all here. Brought to you by the Cybersecurity Council, LLC, Brian Greene and myself, Scott Brammer, will be your hosts. We have come in from the cyber wilderness, not just to share what we have learned, but to find and elevate some of the most important voices in cyber. Brian is a former Division I college football player who has experience across many cybersecurity software startups. He has a successful exit on his resume too. He's also the founder and president of this very community, the Cybersecurity Council. Myself, Scott Brammer, I'm a former Marine and active CISO, and I have 3 patents in cyber and risk. As hosts, we are here to elevate best practices and strengthen the cyber community, both for the community itself and its allies. The Cybersecurity Council has had auspicious beginnings here in the Austin, Texas community, but we are already going worldwide. Everyone should be a cyber practitioner. The views expressed on this podcast, either by us or by our guests, are our own, and they do not necessarily reflect the view of our organizations. This podcast is intended as a forum for professional knowledge, but it is not legal or regulatory advice. Always consult your legal professionals for legal and regulatory matters. And now,
assemble the council.
Welcome to the podcast. Today our guest is Robert Podany. He is a director of Endpoint Systems Management at Charles Schwab. This guy's absolutely brilliant. Robert is a critical thinker in our world of cyber. He has looked at almost every vulnerability out there in the last 10 years and looked them directly in the eye. He's an expert at making large-scale environments operate smoothly and more safely. And when I say large environments, I am talking about environments with more than 100,000 endpoints. He is an expert in vulnerability management, patching, endpoint protection. I need to immediately disclose to our audience that Robert and I are good friends. We worked together at Visa, where we collaborated on technology risk. We helped build governance programs, and we even helped Visa Europe and Visa Inc. become one company again. So with that, good day, Robert. It is very good to see you. Welcome to the podcast.
Thanks, Mr. Brammer. Thanks for having me on the podcast today. So, a large portion of my career has been in the cybersecurity realm. So I started off actually in a company, NTS, National Technical Systems, and just basically the help desk, coming up through the ranks, got my Security Plus through that. And I started really learning in combining all of the different things that I've learned in IT field into cybersecurity career effectively. My real first cybersecurity job was at Farmers Insurance. I moved over from NTS over to Farmers Insurance and got my first cybersecurity consultant effectively. It worked as an internal consultancy. It was really nice. We had a wide range of different security products and security everything that we worked with our technology leaders to implement and employ out through the entire environment. And vulnerability management was one of those things. Funny enough, we utilized some of the same tools that we utilize today. I mean, it's actually not that different from where we were before. And in all reality, a lot of vulnerability management isn't actually that different from where we were 15 years ago to where we are today. The scope changed, your bandwidth got bigger and your ability to affect endpoints got a lot bigger. But for the most part, really that visibility into the endpoints, what you're looking at from an asset perspective, and really taking all of those things and combining them into an effective cybersecurity vulnerability management program is really where the core of it is.
Okay.
Yeah, so I think of vulnerability management in detection / remediation which is your endpoint management solutions. And then I think of it as detection/validation. So one is detecting something, not necessarily vulnerability, but we're utilizing vulnerabilities in this particular instance. But I have an old version of Adobe Reader, right? I have this old version of Adobe Reader. It needs to be updated. That's where detection of that old version of Adobe Reader would come into play, and then remediation of that old version of Adobe Reader, and that's utilizing your endpoint management solutions. And then you have another solution that's also detecting your vulnerability of old, whatever that vulnerability is, old Adobe Reader, right? And then after your management solution remediates it, it's also validating that your remediation actually did remediate it. Because we run into these things all the time. There's currently a curl vulnerability out for Microsoft. It's curl's built in the OS for Microsoft on a whole bunch of stuff, right? I think it's curl 4 or 8.4 is on most environment, or most of our environments. And, there's a memory leak thing that came out for CVE, and, the fix is to update curl. Well, it's built in the OS, right? So it actually just came out. I thought maybe Patch Tuesday will pop in a new version of curl for Microsoft, the built-in curl version, and it didn't. So now we're going back through, that didn't actually solve the problem. Now we have to go and figure out another solution. It's really, and having those two separate tools, and ideally they would even be owned by two separate people, is really also the core of it. Because one is, you really have to, one's your work and then one's your validation. One's your remediation effort, one's your validation effort. And really looking at those things together is really the best methodology, at least in my opinion, to have a really healthy, secure environment.
Can you tell us about your message today? Who is the intended audience? Who are the people within cyber teams or within business teams that you are hoping hear your message?
Yeah, so my message isn't necessarily just for cybersecurity professionals. I'm actually not even in the cybersecurity organization where I work today. My primary message is for the people that are actually operationally doing the work. I think that's one of the core areas, and we kind of forget about some of those things sometimes when we're looking at it from a cybersecurity perspective. It's like either good or bad, but like the actual work for getting those things done comes from operations teams, and it's not necessarily in cybersecurity that you're working with those operations teams. And that's come from the very beginning of my career. I told you I was a cybersecurity consultant effectively internally at Farmers, and we didn't do the work. We had to work with our IT partners to get the work done effectively. And that's across the board for everything. I mean, you can go and have an application that you need code scanning done on that application, and then you need bug fixes fixed and security releases and all of this other stuff. But you're not necessarily working with other cybersecurity professionals getting those things done. You're working with the developers, you're working with the operations folks, you're working with everybody to get the ultimate goal accomplished.
Okay, what I am hearing you say is operational teams matter, partnerships matter, and you need everybody to get vulnerability management, remediation, and other associated tasks accomplished. Okay, take us on the journey. Tell us more.
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, there's a lot of different methodologies and thought processes around vulnerability management as a whole. I would say some of our primary areas within vulnerability management are really just, you look at the, CIS top 10, what is your most important thing? You have to understand what your assets are, right? It always goes back to that asset visibility. So like, what are you actually trying to patch? Am I trying to patch desktop servers? Am I trying to patch Mac, Linux, all of these other things? Or am I trying to patch IoT devices? Is that even in your environment, right? So really understanding your physical hardware and then what you're trying to patch is the core of it. The next part is just, the basics of understanding software, right? Then you have your hardware level. Now you have to go down to your software level. You have to understand what kind of software am I patching, right? Am I patching, Server 2012 servers? Am I patching, Linux boxes that have been in a closet for years, right? Like all of these things. What is your endpoint environment? Are you primarily a VDI shop? Do you have a bunch of virtual desktops or cloud desktops? Or do you have are you Windows 10, right? Windows 11, even a big Mac shop? Like all of those things matter, especially when you're going out and planning from an operations perspective, how you actually attack the problem.
Okay. Robert, I'm going to reflect back to you what I'm hearing. You immediately went to a framework. You brought up the CIS top 20, which might actually be the top 18 now. But what you're talking about is a best practice structure for considering everything that needs to go into a security program. You also immediately went to what is number 1 and number 2 in that structure, which is inventory. And then you started talking to us about what is the scope of the program, what are we trying to defend, what's the attack surface, what's involved. You also started to hint at you better have competence at protecting and configuring and patching those kinds of things. Am I understanding you?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and configuration management's a huge part of that. Vulnerability management as a whole, right? Like if you're configured incorrectly, non-securely or unsecurely, you could very well have, vulnerabilities pop up. Not all vulnerabilities even have CVEs attached to them. I mean, there is a, small subset of things that don't even have CVEs, and some of that comes from secure configurations as well.
I would immediately like to ask you, what's your key takeaway? What's your main idea? I know you're going to share some great insights about vulnerability management today, but what's the top line thought?
I'm going to say, vulnerability management, endpoint vulnerability management is the overall endpoint vulnerability management strategy to secure the endpoint in the environment. It's not just necessarily the vulnerabilities. It's about the configuration. It's about the inventory. It's about everything. You can think about resolving the CVEs on the endpoints, but you also have to think about the entire life cycle. So when is your operating system going to go end of life, right? When are you going to have hardware that's going end of life? Windows 11 requires TVM chips or TPM chips and, TPM 2.0, I believe. So there's hardware that's incompatible with that, especially if you're utilizing BitLocker, right? So it's on.
Okay. Define endpoint vulnerability management for us. And let's see if you could do it for your chief finance officer.
So endpoint vulnerability management is the part of an overall endpoint management strategy to deliver a secure endpoint environment. When most people think about endpoint vulnerability management, they're thinking about resolving CVEs detected on endpoints, right? When in reality, the scope of the entire life cycle of the endpoint, including hardware, OS, software, and configuration, is what ultimately matters.
Okay. Can you say more about life cycle?
Yeah. Life cycle comes in many ways. You can have a life cycle of hardware. Your hardware's X years old. It runs old hardware solutions like old TPM chips, old anything, right? Every vendor is going to have some level of hardware lifecycle in terms of drivers and BIOS updates, right? So the level of support for that hardware. So if a vulnerability comes out that's hardware related, that vendor is only going to support that hardware for X amount of time. So you have to think about that. And that can be more than just endpoints. It could be server, storage, even your networking equipment. You have to think about the life cycle of that. Then you go back to OS, right? OS changes every year, right? You can have a new version of Windows 11 is coming out every year. A new, 22H2, 23H2, 24H2 this year, more than likely, right? And then keep going with that. If you're looking at Macs, their hardware is extremely connected to their operating system. So they don't even offer old operating or new operating systems on old hardware. They life cycle that out completely. And then you kind of have to also think about like software life cycles, right? So internally develop things. If you have been in any form of vulnerability management, migrating from TLS 1.0, 1.1 to 1.2 was a huge project for a lot of companies for their internally developed applications, because their applications had that thing hard coded into their application, so it wasn't modular design. So you have to think about those type of things from a life cycle perspective, both for the developed software itself and then all the modules within that developed software. And then also, configuration change over time. I use TLS as an example, right? Going from 1.1 from a configuration perspective to 1.2 and now 1.3, right? You have to think about the different cipher suites for the configurations as well. Like those things change over time. We've run into issues in the past where someone will take out a weak cipher suite and another person's utilizing that cipher suite to hit an API, and bam, that API connection doesn't work anymore. So,
okay, the information that you're giving is incredibly important. I want our listeners to understand that, Robert, you're talking about big environments. You are a person that has 100,000 endpoints. So when you say VDIs, hardware, development teams, you're probably talking about hundreds or thousands of VDIs, dozens of development teams. So you are talking about a large amount, volume and velocity of life cycle, anticipating vulnerabilities, putting in corrective action plans, remediating. And that's not all you. You've already addressed you need excellence across a lot of different operational teams to get this done. So could you tell us more about, in practice, what are you doing to wrangle a large enterprise and a lot of endpoints? How are you getting all of this done?
Scalability is really the key of it. So I will agree with you. So I am mostly talking about, that's where my experience lies, is massive environments. I mean, even the first company that I worked for was 1,000 people, right? It's not super massive, but it's a lot, and especially when you're looking at all the endpoints all complete. So, but that being said, if you really step back and you think about endpoint software or software as as a whole, right? There's certain core things that all organizations will have in common, right? You're going to have servers potentially, right? For small business or large business, right? Potentially, right? Not every company is going to have servers, but for the most part, you're going to have some level of servers. So what does that mean? Well, that means some level of server OS. Whether you're patching one server OS versus 100, that might change. But when you're going from 100 server OSs or endpoint OSs to 1,000, that doesn't really change very much. That you're utilizing the same methodologies and you're scaling to be able to support those things. My favorite tool ever, I'm going to plug it in, is BigFix. It's a fantastic endpoint management solution, but there's lots of them out there. SCCM is super common, Intune now for Windows, Jamf for Mac. But yeah, you have a whole bunch of different possible solutions. And really the goal is to scale those operations to go from the 100 to the 1,000 or the 10,000 or the 100,000, right? Realistically, I mean, whether you're a small business, patching 100 systems, that might take you 2 weeks. But guess what? You have the same Patch Tuesday comes up for all of us for Windows and Microsoft. So whether I'm patching 100,000 endpoints or 100 endpoints, I still only have a month to do it to be able to get to the next level. So it's all about scalability.
Okay, scalability is absolutely important, but you also just brought up efficiency, timelines and timeframes, required remediation periods. You have to get this fixed in a month. You've got to get this fixed in 2 weeks. What drives most of your discussions within your endpoint vulnerability management team? When you are talking amongst practitioners, how are you guys juggling the ball?
So The funny thing is I manage personally over 60,000 endpoints in the current environment that I'm in. I do that with 3 people as a whole. And, two of them kind of back each other up, and the third one works on more third-party type vulnerabilities.
Okay, I want to hear more, but I need to immediately jump in here. You have a 4-person team, 60,000 endpoints, and you are getting the job done at scale, at velocity, at volume. So to everybody out there listening that is looking at a large list of vulnerabilities and it is shaking them to the core right now, you need to understand it can be done. The guy sitting in front of me, Robert, gets it done. He and his team. And he's probably going to tell us a lot more about scalability and what that means and talk to us about some tools. But I just wanted to pause here and tell the world it can be done. Please say more, Robert.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's very, very accurate. I mean, like how you actually start to accomplish some of these things. Let's take Chrome as an example. Chrome and Edge, right? Very common Microsoft products, or Edge common Microsoft product, Chrome's common browser across the entire endpoint solution.
And oftentimes, Chrome and Edge as web browsers represent one of the greatest access vectors for malicious agents into an environment. What do you got?
Absolutely, yeah. So Chrome and Edge, perfect candidates for the auto update processes that actually delivered directly from Google and directly from Microsoft. They come with Ring updates, so you can go into canary versions of them. You can go into beta versions of them, and then they roll out slowly over time. Chrome, I think last year, I don't know the exact numbers, but it was well over 50 version deployments just for Chrome, just last year. That's over one a week, or that's one a week at least.
Okay, that is what you're saying is beautiful. I immediately want to ask, how do you handle the edge cases, like the development team that wants the canary version, or the corporate IT team that needs a locked down version to hand over to people in culture or a human resources team? How do you handle the edge cases?
Yeah, so it's a combination of a lot of things. So like Chrome offers an extended version. It's not extended support. I don't remember what it's called off the top of my head. We don't utilize it. We use the stable versions for all of my personal releases, but you can utilize those. Really what you do whenever you're trying to handle the edge cases, right? The core of it is edge cases are just that, potentially, if you allow them to be. So sometimes you just have to fight through the edge. Like, oh, I want this HR team to be on this specific version of Chrome. I'm sorry, no. Like, you're not allowed to be on that specific version of Chrome. Chrome has vulnerabilities. You need to patch Chrome. Like, it's pretty black and white in some of those cases. Now, you have to look at business operations. You have to look at everything, right? A lot of people get in their own heads of, I have to be on these certain things. That's not necessarily how things go anymore in terms of like browsers, because the browsers change so rapidly. You have to actually start to think about it. And this goes back to development life cycles for products that we utilize. You have to build that into the development life cycle of the applications to know that Chrome's going to change over time. It's going to change rapidly over time too. There are going to be new feature releases. I think it's every 6 weeks, but I almost want to say it's every 4 weeks now. Chrome releases a major version. Like, we're on 124 right now during this podcast, right? And multiple minor releases within there. Chrome 124. So really you can break them up. To go back to your question around edge cases, right? You can break them up, but any pause is just that. It's a pause. It's not you're going to stay on this version of Chrome forever. No, I mean, you could theoretically get into a situation like back in college, a professor of mine said, the most secure computer is one that's sitting on the floor in a box, right? That's your most secure form of a computer. Once you take that computer out and set it up, inherently becomes less secure. Now you go and you plug it into power, turn it on. Oh, it's even less secure at that point. and you just keep going down the road.
Connecting it to the cloud, connecting it to networks, connecting it to additional services, connecting it to Internet of Things.
Install any software. It just continues to get less secure. So you can always go and like theoretically come in and work those things out. Like you can have compensating controls around those type of assets and be like, oh, look, I'm going to make sure that this computer isn't, joined to a network or joined to the internet. Well, yeah, then you need a web browser in some of those cases, right? So yeah, you can have compensating controls for certain things. But at the end of the day, for those edge cases, kind of have to utilize your sort of governance process. If you have it, you have to really understand what is risk. What is risk to the organization that you're trying to secure versus what's the benefit of keeping those edge cases as edge cases.
Okay, you've offered a lot of information. You covered being aware of business obligations. So you do want to entertain notions of edge cases, find out their root cause. You also immediately said that there are times when cyber and or policy needs to say no, that we don't want to go down this path. We don't have the resources to manage it. It's because of life cycle going to change anyway. And you also talked about technology risk as a whole. Do you want to say more about any of those things?
Really, there is one core thing, right? You and everybody as a cybersecurity professional isn't there to secure the world, depending on the business that you run. You're not part of the DoD necessarily, right? You're not part of massive security organizations that focus really heavily on security. You're not there to secure the world. You're there to secure that organization. And then you're there to secure that organization in a way for that organization to continue doing business, right? Your goal and all of our goals as cybersecurity professionals isn't necessarily there to say no. Our goals are there to meet business need and then do it securely. That's the whole goal of cybersecurity, in my opinion, right? You're not there to release the strongest computer in a box. You're there to make sure that the business has what it needs to be able to do that business. So,
fantastically said, my friend. Fantastically said. When you are setting up your endpoint vulnerability management practice, when you are working with your team members, what criteria or KPIs are you paying attention to? And does that change based on your audience? What I'm really trying to ask here is, do you talk a different language with your team in terms of KPIs than when you are talking with the C-suite, the board, or higher level reporting?
That's
it's a loaded question. So let's go step by step. What are your KPIs? What are you trying to keep visibility on in your immediate team? You're sitting there with your engineers.
Yeah. So, this is a complicated question for me, only purely for the fact that when we think about traditional vulnerability management, break things up into like critical, high, medium, whatever, right? Severity. We give it a severity, and then we give it SLAs to go and meet. You have to do these criticals within 7 days or whatever, highs within 30. You choose your poison, right? Whatever it ultimately is. And so when I look at vulnerability management, I'm talking about it with my team. I don't necessarily look at it in terms of SLAs. The SLA is as fast as possible.
Pay attention, listeners. Here comes the magic.
Yeah, so it's mean time to resolution is my primary KPI that I focus on. Realistically, like if you want to run a successful security organization or endpoint vulnerability management program, you're not necessarily focusing on the vulnerability. So like if a medium or high, let's just say a medium Chrome vulnerability comes up, or a high Chrome vulnerability, let's use high Chrome vulnerability comes up, and it's on 100,000 endpoints, but you have a critical vulnerability that pops up and it's on 5 endpoints. In my opinion, I focus more and I'll put more resources to fixing the 100,000 than the 5. Depending on where it's at. Like if it's a critical vulnerability on the edge and you're doing web scanners and all this other stuff.
Okay. You are practicing technology risk management. You're looking at what is the exposure, what is the risk of this vulnerability in the environment, and a less severe vulnerability that has more volume and perhaps more access vectors is actually more risky than its inherent or residual risks might indicate. So you are doing more mental gymnastics than the tools tell you to do. And you are doing that because you're a risk professional.
Yeah, I mean, that is my, that was one of our roles back at Visa at times, right? So, yeah, I mean, you have to take those things into account. But also, like I said, ultimately, the goal isn't, oh, I have a high vulnerability, I have 30 days to fix it. That's not the right mindset. The mindset should be, I have a high vulnerability, when can I fix it next?
Okay. I want to try to offer some information for our audience here. Remediation timelines. How long do you have to fix something? There's some industry best practices on this, and they are changing. In the past, it would be something like you have 7 days to fix a critical severity item. That would be best practice. People would strive to do that. This is changing. In my experience, I'm now encountering financial clients and other clients from highly regulated industries that will say, no, you have 48 hours. They will look at their third and fourth parties and say, you have 48 hours to address a critical. Often, that is focused on products and services and critical needs. That might not be infrastructure. There's lots of variability here, but there are best practices. There are SLAs, service level agreements. Fix this in this time frame. Robert, what you said is all of that is important, but I need to look at the entire life cycle. I need to consider the entire program, and there are times where I look at mean time to repair first and most. Do you want to say more about that?
Yeah, mean time to resolution. Yeah, so I mean, that's where you're really trying to strive to be. You want that number to be as low as possible, because then your attack surface is lower. So if you're managing 100,000 endpoint environment, right, and that's different between the environments. Like if you're managing a 100 endpoint environment, which I never have, so I actually don't know the answer to these things. But it's a different mindset than when you're managing the 100,000 endpoint, for sure. And like, if you're looking at it from an operations perspective, and a lot of, unfortunately, like you actually go through a very common metric, and I don't necessarily agree with it. It's your percentage of overdue. A lot of people look at it, or like the percentage of vulnerabilities that you can actually fix within the time frame of whatever the SLA is, right? I don't necessarily like that particular metric, your percentage of overdue, because your denominator changes depending on how you're actually looking at it, like calculating that number out. So, Patch Tuesday comes around and your percentage of overdue goes down to like, oh, I'm at, 2% overdue now. Well, you just added 100, 200,000 vulnerabilities to your environment all at once. So yeah, okay, I get that. Especially if you're looking at scanners, right? Like that's really what the core of it is.
Okay. You just talked about how some KPIs are not valuable at scale, or they can just simply be very confusing when you talk about a Patch Tuesday and 100,000 new vulnerabilities show up in an environment. So how do you talk a governance board, an executive, or some other high-level authority or partner through that? How do you get them to understand the variability of endpoint vulnerability management and get them to see you're getting it done? How do you get them past the noise?
Yeah. So a lot of, from an executive perspective, executives are busy, right? They're running the business effectively, or they're running the things that you're trying to deliver from a business perspective. So your standard KPIs are going to be things, like I said, like percentage overdue. And that's what they're going to see, right? That's what they're going to ultimately look at. Because it's an easy metric to see. It's not the nitty gritty metric. It's not the metric that you're necessarily going through with your vulnerability teams directly. But I mean, I honestly think mean time to resolution is a fantastic metric. Like, I think it's very underlooked. Like, how fast are you fixing things in your environment? And then taking the MTTR number throughout.
Okay, I absolutely want to agree with you on MTTR as valuable for showing to the executive reporting levels, because that metric points to immediately to the problems that you need to address. It's often like this development team over here in the corner is still on this old version of .NET. I can show you right there, this is where I'm having a problem with MTTR. Or you can pivot over here and go, I still have all of this stuff on the last version of Windows 11 because there's a blocker for finance software with the corporate IT team, and MTTR allows you to communicate, here's the problems that we have to get past.
Yeah, working with different groups and figuring out those types of solutions. So yeah, I mean, that MTTR metric, mean time to resolution, is it's a great metric, because look, if you have 50,000 endpoints, all Windows 10, right? You're gonna have, and let's just say they're all on the same version of Windows 10, 22H2 latest April patch. We'll take today. So, and then you're patching May patches, right? You can go and you can look at, I have a mean time of resolution for these specific endpoints versus, these other endpoints because of X, right? And there's definitely those types of groups. I mean, there's groups that we work with today, like we don't patch them all at the same time, right? So like BDIs, do we necessarily want to patch BDIs in the middle of the day? Or you don't necessarily want to patch most things in the middle of the day. Sometimes we do. Laptops, right? The whole idea of, maintenance schedules and such. Like I'll patch a laptop right in the middle of the day, right? And then I'll give them people time to reboot, obviously. You don't want to cause impact to the business, right? CIA is availability, that triad, right? So confidentiality, integrity, and availability, CIA triad. That's something that I think that a lot of cybersecurity professionals forget. So
there's an important nuance to what you are saying, and I would want to make sure anybody that's part of a small or medium business hears what you just said. You started our conversation with scalability, being able to address problems at scale, and you just explained that there are times where you, the director of Endpoint, makes the call, this is getting patched right now, today in the middle of the business day. Now, the person that is getting patched, the endpoint, may have until the end of the day or afterwards to do a reboot and accept all of the updates, but you are making the call. It's getting delivered right now. I think that is important for the audience to hear, because I often find that lots of vulnerability management teams, corporate IT teams, security teams find themselves in all of these sticky situations where they don't feel like they can move forward with some types of patching or remediations. And I just wanted to make sure it was very clear. There are companies out there with 60,000 endpoints, and the director of Endpoint can press the button right now. That is very cool.
Yeah.
It's also cool that they know your capabilities of yourself and your team. They know you treat them right. They believe in what you do, and you've had this job for years, man. They believe in you, and they know you're going to make the right choice by them. I just want everybody to hear that. You press the patch button. You're not asking for permission to do it. It's already set in policy. It's already approved by your organization. Yeah. You're doing it reasonably. You're doing it with business obligations in mind, but you get to press the button. That's awesome.
Yeah, you are responsible for it, right? No executive is going to go in and say, Robert, why didn't you patch this one specific Windows 10 box? No, it's you that is responsible for patching that one specific Windows 10 box. It's no one else. Especially when you get down to it. I mean, a lot of it is confidence and really understanding the roles that you and the responsibilities that you have as a operations team manager. If I will say the inverse is true too. If I press the button, I break something. Guess who has to be on the calls? The resolution calls. This guy, right? So there's that aspect too, which is also really important, or why testing is really important. So we have a pretty in-depth testing process that we go to as well before we release patches, certification, deployment. We also don't deploy everything all at once. Like the whole idea of a big bang approach is not a good approach to anything patch remediation, because you don't necessarily know, especially in your environment, deploying out new features and everything like that.
Yep. So sometimes patches have flaws in them.
Yeah, so very much so. Yeah, very much so. Sometimes, like Google Chrome is actually a perfect example. Like you're relying on a third-party vendor, right? You're relying on Google to release Google products.
Microsoft has never had a bad patch. Never
right?
once.
But like I've seen Google release multiple Google Chrome releases in a day. I actually don't know if that's true, but I've seen them rapidly deploy them for sure. So that happens. I mean, even Google changed configurations on you. A couple of versions ago, I think it was back in February. By default, Google just enabled functionality called storage partitioning, and it was disabled by default, and then it was enabled by default. And
right.
If you and it wasn't even a major release version; it was a minor release version. And if you didn't know, and you had applications that required that level or didn't meet that requirement, then you would have been impacted. Now, I mean, it was in Chrome for years at that point, and they enabled it, but it was still enabled in a minor version. So,
you, Robert, you're definitely in an organization that is thriving. You are describing certification, testing, deployments, engineering teams that help with the deliveries. There's a lot of excellence behind what you are describing, right? What are some of the common problems that come back to you, Director of Endpoint, to resolve?
Realistically, it's going to be education of end users and developers, right? You have a lot of developers that develop in different ways and do different things, right? And so we'll use Node.js as an example, right? Node.js.
It's a good example. Many versions.
Many versions.
Including end of support and end of life versions.
Python is also one of those examples, right? So you have these people that come in, they start utilizing Python X, and then guess what? New version of Python comes in and it isn't backwards compatible with the old feature sets that you're utilizing. What do you do? Right. So that's like primarily what would come across my desk in terms of, oh, we need your help to solve these sort of things, because then you have to go back through development.
Tell me more. Walk me through the next couple of steps. And I'm personally curious because I see Node.js and Python, and developer X wants to use version 3.9 of Python, and I know it's got a critical vulnerability. What does Robert Podany do? How do you handle the situation?
Well, I mean, ultimately, you have to work with the end users, and you have to work within the teams themselves to actually solve these things. This is where really development standards come into play from an organizational perspective, however, and that's where you really have to come back and rely on those things. So, our development standard says you have to keep on the latest version of X. Like if you're going to use Node.js, you have to make sure that you're developing against the later versions and you have life cycle within your application. So we do have legacy applications that we have to, take into account, and there's development cycles and all of these things. And that's really where also governance comes into play. So me as a person, as an individual, is not actually responsible for that. If, someone needs X and, we can't provide that for them in terms of vulnerabilities, right? I don't get to make the decision based off of what I want, other than you have to be on the later versions because it resolves, whatever Y vulnerability. we actually punt it through we take it through the governance process, and that's really the governance risk acceptance. It goes back down to sidetracking here. It's talking about remediation as a whole. There's realistically, in my opinion, 4 different remediation treatments, 4 flavors of remediation. You can avoid, right? You can avoid a vulnerability, and that's taking something offline or even quarantining it, right? You can transfer the risk of that vulnerability. So moving the risk to another third party potentially, right? SaaS solutions are kind of also that, and even insurance is a possibility, right? I understand that I'm running this old version of X, but if we get popped, well, we have the cyber insurance that's explicitly covering us for this. The next one is acceptance, possibly. Governance risk acceptance, going through that whole process. And then lastly is just mitigating, which is where patching comes into play or applying compensating controls. I'll actually tell a great story, fantastic story. Doesn't have anything to do with patching, but I'm going to tell a story anyways. So I worked for Farmers Insurance. We had a web application firewall in place, and we noticed that outside sites were scraping some of our quotes, right? And so we can see it through the web application firewall traffic. Well, your first thought is like, oh, I don't want our competitor to see these quotes, right? They could,
Yes. So in a world of insurance, quotes and rates is not just intellectual property, but it is your competitive muscle.
Yeah.
You have to get it right for both your customers and to differentiate yourself from your competitors. So incredibly important information. So it was getting scraped.
It's getting scraped, right? Now think about this. Okay, well, what else is there out there? Oh, there's quote aggregation tools. So if we block access to this quote aggregation tools, like take that out, help me try and find cheaper insurance, looking through that. And then, this quote aggregator comes up and you block it utilizing your WAF and say, oh yeah, we don't want this to scrape our website to be able to look up these quotes. And now it's different because you have APIs and, all this other stuff. Then when you block it, you wouldn't be part of that solution anymore. So you wouldn't have the opportunity to give that person a quote, right? So, okay, great. We don't necessarily want to block it. So what did we do? We just ended up rate limiting it so it's not constantly scraping the environment. You still have the ability to scrape the environment and get quotes, but you don't have the ability to constantly price check your competitors necessarily. So it's a great example of it's a great example of security and enabling the business, because you still want the business. Yeah, you still want the business to work, but you want to do it in a secure way, right? So our secure way was rate limiting those scrapers and still allowing the quotes to go through.
So let's talk about risk acceptance for a moment, and let's go back to what you started bringing up: Node.js and Python, specific tools to enable development or even directly used tools by developers. Required for risk acceptance, it would be identified, an exception would be created, I would document this team or this person needs this, but part of my risk acceptance process, and I'm speaking from being in a small company, whereas you're talking about 60,000 endpoints, I would do all of the documentation, but I, cyber, am not accepting the risk. So I am going to turn around to that development team and or a product team. You are not following the standard. Do you accept this risk? You can give me the acceptance, and I will embrace that acceptance and enable you to do your job. I won't get in your way, but I'm simultaneously going to demand your corrective action plan or your remediation plan. You want to be on this old version of Python. When does it go away? That's part of the risk acceptance discussion. You want to be on this old version of Node.js. When does this risk go away? If I, as the cyber person, am unhappy with the timelines and the corrective action plans, I'm going to move to mitigations. What else can I do to reduce the risk of this issue? So I immediately want to turn this over to you, Robert, and ask 60,000 endpoints, large organization, how are you getting the risk acceptance accomplished? What kind of compensating controls are within your scope as director of endpoint versus when do you go, you need to add this, and you're telling another team to do the work?
Yeah. Well, I should clarify. I don't do any of that.
So that's important to say. You're about to tell us about how your organization works, and there's lessons here. So go ahead.
I don't do any of that. So we work through completely different groups and teams. We have partners that we work with within those teams, and we send it over there. So you don't want to be on this version. This is a standard. This is the requirement. You have to be on this version. Great. Here you go. You're more than welcome to go through this governance process. And governance processes are long and painful and bureaucratic. They have always been. That's the definition of governance processes. But they also mostly, and not all governance processes work the same. Some people think like risk acceptance is risk acceptance for everything. That's not accurate.
Actively managed software. You've brought up a couple of times, you talking to a team member or an organization, you're not on the required version. That implies actively managed software. Should I think about it that way, or should I just think about it as standard?
Yeah. So I actually own a few teams at where I'm at today. And another team that I own is our software packaging, certification, and deployment team, and that's separate from vulnerability management team. But so what I mean by actively managed software is you always want to, let alone vulnerabilities are one thing, right? Taking vulnerabilities into account is one whole thing. Then you got to start looking at other things outside of just vulnerabilities, right? Because your vulnerability scanners and your patches that come out, they're only going to be so much things, right? So like we'll take Adobe Reader again as an example. You might not necessarily have your vulnerability scanner release every month a new vulnerability for Adobe Reader. It might not do it, right? It might not qualify for a CVE or whatever it is. Whatever the thing is that the vulnerability manager or scanner people decide needs to be, relative to that. So you also want to have an actively managed process. So actually, you know what? We're going to take Java as a perfect example. Java releases quarterly. So you have quarter releases of Java. Happens every quarter. You know it's going to happen. So you can schedule that every single quarter. You say, okay, look, it's going to release on this date. I need to be prepared, and I need to package it, and need to certify it, and then I need to deploy it. And that's what I mean by actively managed software. So you don't necessarily want to just wait for a vulnerability scanner or something else, a patch to come out to tell you, oh, now you have X amount of days to go out and do this. You want to always be up and ready to do that. And that goes back to, my original statement, right? It's not just about vulnerability management. It's about management of the environment as a whole. I remember I said, it's part of the overall endpoint management strategy to deliver a secure endpoint environment. So it's not just vulnerability management. It's not just patching specific vulnerabilities because of CVEs. It's about managing life cycle. It's about managing, end of life software, right? You have to make sure that you're keeping all of these things up to date and constant. That's really where the operational aspects of things come into play. You're going to want to make sure that you're effectively planning constantly.
Our many thanks to Robert Podany, Director of Endpoint over at Charles Schwab, for joining us on this call. We look forward to talking to him again. Please join us on the cybersecuritycouncil.com. Find our podcast on Apple Podcasts. Come to our next event.